Thank you to Ellen Jordan for inviting me to participate in this, and also for the absolutely excellent organisation of this workshop, particularly given the current circumstances. Is that working okay? Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today, as you just heard, is wandering workers, so economic mobility among skilled workers in the Roman world. And this is something that really is a kind of intersection of my interests. As Astrid was just saying, I'm interested in migration, I'm interested in labour. So this is kind of where those two come together. And I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently, because I've been working on an entry for the Oxford Classical Dictionary on economic mobility. So this is something that I'm still working on. So I'm developing it a bit further here, and hopefully in the future, after I get some feedback from you today, I'll be able to work this up a little bit further. So just thinking in general about mobility, I mean, in the early to mid 20th century, there was this paradigm that pre-industrial societies were by and large static and immobile, that it was with industrialization that we get this huge increase in mobility, and that, you know, actually industrialization is facilitated by that mobility. So we have that sort of contrast drawn, that break between pre-industrial and industrial societies. And of course, by the 1970s, early modern historians are objecting to this. Medieval historians are saying, you know, no, this isn't true. And ancient historians increasingly so, particularly by the kind of later years of the 20th century. So yes, the scale is different after, you know, 1850 or so on, not least because of those huge changes in transport infrastructure, but that idea that people in Europe weren't moving on any noticeable scale before that simply isn't true. And by the late 20th century, migration studies were very much emphasizing movement in pre-modern societies. So in 1999, Lucassen and Lucassen were able to say, you know, during the last decade, it has become clear to historians working in the field of migration that this phenomenon has to be regarded as a normal and structural element of human societies throughout history. The new paradigm teaches us that migration is part of the general human pattern, essential for the functioning of families and crucial to the operation of the labour market. So I suppose what I'd like to do today is just add to that voice that mobility is a normal and structural part of ancient societies. I'm just going to start with some medieval and early modern comparative material, just to kind of set this up and as something to think with in this better documented period. I mean, one of the big drivers of mobility in that period, in the medieval and early modern period, was the movement of domestic servants. Now, as we all know, that was a big driver of population movement in the Roman period also, but that was mainly the enforced movement of enslaved workers, so involuntary rather than voluntary movement. I think it's perhaps worth raising there that distinction between voluntary and involuntary mobility is a bit forced. So how far is voluntary movement really voluntary if you have to move, if your economic situation means that, you know, you are forced to move essentially in order to find work? And I think, you know, we were asked if we could link in some of our work to kind of the modern academy and the precarious job situation. I think, you know, a lot of us will relate to that early in our careers, we very often move around in a way that we wouldn't necessarily always choose to do. So that distinction between voluntary and involuntary can be a little bit difficult. But what I want to do today, if I can, is focus more on that voluntary movement of free workers. Excuse me, also got a bit of a throat today. So in medieval and early modern Europe, alongside domestic workers, skilled workers also moved. And in the apprenticeship system, craftsmen who had completed an apprenticeship often travelled for several years as journeymen in order to gain experience in their chosen field. So something that they did as a stage in their training, really, before they became masters. A tradition that, you know, continues even now with the Wandergesellen of Central Europe. So this is kind of organised tramping, and it began to develop in the later Middle Ages. So we hear about it from around 1350 onwards. By the later 15th century and into the early 16th century, it becomes an actual requirement for many craft guilds. So that market in itinerant skilled labour becomes a really central feature of pre-modern European crafts. Now, workers were typically young, so they are roughly between 15 and 29, and unmarried. And the percentage, if you look at census data from those periods, the percentage within an urban population varied over time and between cities, but in some cases it could be as high as 25% of the population. So in some instances, it is a really significant driver of population movement. And one of the interesting things I think that research in that area throws up is the different spatial patterns between different crafts. So the distances moved are different for different crafts. And also you get specific links between areas. So you get some kind of well-trodden routes, I mean, literally well-trodden routes. And also this is very often, it's not random movement, it's quite organised, it's quite focused. The choice of routes is economic. You go where it's best to find work in your particular craft specialism, and that tends to be known knowledge, which also suggests some kind of openness in that labour market. It suggests some level of knowledge of the labour market. Now, it's something of a generalisation, but roughly speaking, the more specialised a trade, the further people moved. So those who worked in the production of sort of everyday necessities, so tailors, shoemakers, they tended to move very little, generally local or regional movement for those kind of workers. But for more specialised crafts, so kind of things that you usually only find in larger towns, they moved over significant distances, and long distance tramping becomes kind of part of the culture there. Also, in some sectors, so something like the building industry as well, you get almost two layers of migrants. You get those who were constantly on the move, those people who were itinerant, doing small jobs and repairs as they went. And then you get kind of more specialised, more skilled builders or construction workers who kind of work on major building sites and stay there for longer periods of time, which I think leads on to that kind of issue of the distinction between migration and mobility, that those terms aren't always interchangeable. So migration tends to be interpreted as a kind of one-time move, or at least something that it's infrequent and intermittent, whereas mobility is something kind of more fluid. It has more of a sense of itinerancy, often linked with seasonality. So I'm interested here in both migration and also in mobility. One other thing about the early modern situation is that this system was important not only for the personal and professional development of the individuals concerned, but also for the diffusion of skills and knowledge and techniques and artistic styles over a wider geographic region. And this mobility is very much facilitated by guilds. I think that is something to bear in mind as quite a key difference to the Roman experience. So the guilds were very important in the stimulus, the organisation, and the practical organisation and functioning of this system of movement. But really why I start with this, I think, is that it's useful to think with. It raises some interesting questions about what kind of picture we might find in the Roman period. And so kind of following on from that, I'm thinking about 5 questions essentially. So who moved? What kinds of workers can we see moving? Or at least, what kind of workers can we see in our evidence? Secondly, can we see any patterns of movement? So like in the medieval and early modern period, do we see more specialised workers moving further? Can we see particular links between particular regions? Can we see any evidence of chain migration? Can we see any evidence of mobility being organised along shared geographic lines? Thirdly, how was movement organised? So in the absence of guilds of a medieval type, how, if at all, was movement of skilled labour organised? Did professional associations play any role in this? Did labour contractors play any role in this? Did the state play any role in this? Fourth, how did people prove their skills and professional identity? So again, in the absence of a guild system that helped people prove their identity and their skills, how did people prove their credentials? How did they demonstrate that they were who they said they were and that they were skilled enough to undertake the jobs that they're looking for? And finally, and this is one that I haven't really thought of at all yet, but how far did mobility of skilled workers help the spread of technology, skills and professional practices? So I'm going to focus here on the first three questions, the fourth one to a certain extent, but I kind of addressed some of that in the previous paper that I did for this workshop. So I'm hoping to focus on those first three questions, and I'm going to look at two case studies. The first one being medical practitioners, and the second one kind of being construction, as broadly understood. So architects and other workers in construction. So as I say, this is something that I'm still working on, but I'm hoping to use these two case studies today to kind of suggest some ideas about how skilled labour might be moving. So firstly, medical practitioners. I mean, we know that medical practitioners were highly mobile in the Roman period. It's one of the mobile professions. And I'm using the term medical practitioner deliberately, I mean, because it covers a broad range of people, some of whom were more skilled, more professional, if we can use that word, than others. I mean, as we all know, there's no licensing or set training for medical practitioners in the ancient world. But our evidence does suggest that they are mobile. I mean, we have the most famous examples. We have people like Galen, who came from Pergamum to Rome in the 2nd century. But, you know, we have, if we look at our inscriptional evidence, we have examples on a kind of lower down the social scale. So, for example, here's a couple of inscriptions from Rome. So we've got Sosikrates of Nicaea on that tombstone there from Rome, the 20th century, in 20 CE. And he's just had his name added on the bottom of the funerary marker there. So the tombstone itself is to two freed slaves of the Monartes family, and he's been added there on the bottom. Or this other example here from of a Dr. Flavius Coelius Severus from Side in modern Turkey. So 2nd century example there. Or Astrid mentioned that I'm working on Roman Iberia. So just a couple of examples from the work that I've been doing from there. You've got Publius Frontinius Sciscola, Medicus of the inhabitants of Colonia Patricia. Now this tombstone was found at Solia, so 60 or 70 kilometers away from Patricia Colonia. It's not clear, I don't think, whether this individual is from either of those places, whether he's just working in Colonia Patricia, but I think clearly it's somebody who is mobile. And similarly, Quintus Apponius Rusticus, who is an eye doctor, a medicus ocularius, and he is also from Patricia, from Colonia Patricia. And his tombstone comes from Augusta Emerita, so Merida, which is about 180 kilometers away from Patricia Colonia. So again, another mobile individual. It's not clear, I guess, in these instances, when you have a tombstone, if you're looking at kind of mobility or long-term migration, this is where these people happen to die, whether it was where they planned to die is the wrong way of putting it, but where they intended to stay, or they just happened to die in that place. So it's a bit difficult to distinguish between mobility and migration, I think, in these instances, but certainly they are mobile. I think below that, we've probably got more itinerancy, more kind of local, regional movement. So kind of lesser, if you will, medical practitioners are more itinerant, moving around rural areas, moving between towns. So that's where Cicero's Pharmacopoeia Circumfranius here comes in. This is Lucius Clodius of Ancona. So Cicero claims that when looking for poison, Opiniacus, his father, pays this itinerant pharmacist 2,000 sesterces for drugs to kill his mother-in-law. And this is someone who happened to be passing through on his way to other towns. So that fora multa, as it's described there. In terms of patterns of movement here, I guess we see principally movement from east to west. So Greece and Asia Minor seem to be particularly places where doctors in the west come from. Also Egypt crops up. So Vivian Nutton's work has the statistics of 90% of doctors named on inscriptions in the 1st century have Greek names, 75% in the 2nd century, 70% in the 3rd century. So it goes down, but it's still significant. I think that's where we ask, what does a Greek name mean? Does it necessarily mean these people were from the East? I mean, as a doctor, does it become associated with the Greek world? And so do you take on a Greek name? Is that what's expected of you? Does that give you some kind of credentials? Does it make you look a bit more serious if you have a Greek name? I think that's just something to think about. And I would say in terms of patterns of movement and organisation, that we've probably got different layers of movement here. And as so often, there's no singular model that works. At the top level, we have clear official encouragement of movement. That's most clearly seen at Rome, as we would probably expect in the imperial period. I mean, Pliny the Elder tells us that the first doctor in Rome came in 219 BC. That's this one here. And that he was kind of given Roman citizenship, and he was given a taberna to set up a surgery at public expense. So there's a kind of sense of official sanction here. And Caesar, granted doctor citizenship to stay. Augustus exempted them from general expulsion of foreigners from Rome, which I guess points both to their foreignness, as it were, and their status. How they proved that status isn't clear, whether they kind of made a declaration before a magistrate, whether there were testimonials. I mean, how, in thinking about how you prove your credentials, it's not clear how you do this in that context either. Also on the PowerPoint, there's a Pliny talking about kind of spread of a new skin disease that comes to Rome in the under Tiberius, comes from Asia Minor, he says, and it's something that spreads throughout, not the lower orders, if you will, but amongst the elite, because they're kissing each other and they're passing this skin disease on. And because of that, it's something that originated in, well, it says Asia Minor, but also from Egypt. You get doctors who are devoted to that complaint. So that kind of directed movement of specialists in a particular area of medicine. And Pliny also tells us that when Casinus, a Roman knight who was friends with Nero, fell victim to this skin disease, he brought in a doctor specifically again from Egypt, but he decided on giving him something Spanish fly, taken and drink, which killed him. So in this instance, being friends with Nero did not work out too well. But again, there's that specific focused movement of specialists between one place and another. Obviously, they're quite specific, very elite examples, but We know that smaller towns were also encouraging the mobility of doctors, and that this was a point of pride, that in a world of civic rivalry, having the best doctors alongside the best teachers and so on was important, and town councils could grant tax immunity to doctors, and the number was set by Antoninus Pius at between 5 and 10, depending on the size of the city, which is something that actually Rebecca Swarsfield's excellent paper earlier in the year talked about, on those privileges, exemptions, official encouragement of medical mobility. Below that, I guess we have the more itinerant mobility of the kind of lesser practitioner, if you will. In terms of showing your credentials, I mean, I think also in that panel, is it Jane who's talking next, talked about the running jokes of bad doctors. So obviously it is quite difficult to prove your worth. The best way, of course, is by direct recommendation, by word of mouth. So Cicero recommends a medicus from Patrae to Servius. That's at the highest levels, of course. Whether that's happening lower down the social scale, probably, but it's something that we can't really document. Reputation, of course, is also important. And if you don't have one, well, you create one. Medicine is quite public in the Roman world. It's practiced in public places, in workshops that are deliberately open and visible, filled with observers and onlookers. So if you are successful in treating a patient, it would be known about. Of course, if you're not successful, that would also be known about, but this is one way of creating a reputation. And a certain level of skill could perhaps also be implied by adherence to a particular medical sect, or by an association with a particular famous doctor. So those links are kind of part of self-promotion and advertising. Even if, and I think this is quite important, even if they are entirely unverifiable and in fact fictitious, there's probably a certain amount of fakery going on here. There's a wonderful story in Galen about another doctor in Rome who is saying that he's been taught by Galen, that Galen has taught him everything he knows, and Galen goes and watches him try to cure somebody of a toothache, saying that Galen himself taught me this. So this doctor is from Aleppo. Whether it's again, that kind of Eastern connection is important, but he tells the crowd he's from Aleppo, that he's learned everything from Galen, and he goes through this elaborate treatment for a toothache. And Galen watches the treatment, and then he kind of unmasks himself at the end and says, I'm Galen. This is not Galen. I'm Galen. This is a swindler. And he kind of has him taken away and has him flogged. Now, whether that's for fraud, whether that's the norm that the authorities would be involved in this kind of thing, or whether that's just because it's Galen and he's very well connected, but there's something going on there. So reputation, association with other doctors, also perhaps a Greek connection. So not only do we get lots of Greek names, but also if we look at stamps, so oculist stamps or collyrium stamps, as they're also known. This is one example from the British Museum. There's hundreds of these across Gaul and Britain and Germany, and they are stamped, they indicate either the owner or the practitioner of the kind of eye ointments that they stamp. They're principally Greek, the names are principally Greek. So whether being Greek gives it a certain cachet, that makes it a bit more believable, that medicine is imagined to be something that is associated with the Greek world. And finally on this, I also wonder, and this is something I've yet to fully pursue, but I wonder also about the kit that you carry. This becomes more standardized and more uniform in the Roman period, whether there's a particular core set of instruments. There's a kind of pretty standardized rectangular or cylindrical, there's both types, storage cases, and whether This is an example here of one of them, pretty famous one from Lyon in the 2nd century. So this is one of the rectangular storage cases. Whether they become recognizable, like the sort of doctor's bag of the 19th century, whereas that, if you have the right kit, that makes the right impression. That's just something else that I've been wondering about in terms of showing that you are a serious doctor. So doctors, I think, are probably among the best documented examples of professional mobility. Numerically, though, I think that it's probably those who worked in construction who were the most mobile, particularly skilled workers. I mean, unskilled labourers were probably not very mobile. They would move regionally, locally, but I don't imagine they're necessarily moving over huge distances. I mean, I think the medieval pattern of the more specialised a worker is, the more geographically mobile they are, probably holds. I mean, construction work is, by its very nature, it's finite and it's very often seasonal, which will have encouraged mobility and itinerancy among construction workers, because their individual skills would only be required for a relatively short period of time. At the very top level, we see the movement of architects. Now, there's lots of examples of that. I mean, perhaps most famously, it's Apollodorus, who comes from Damascus to Rome to design Trajan's Forum and his baths. But that mobility isn't just confined to kind of famous people at that level. Again, from Spain, we have this altar, which was dedicated to Augustan Mars by an architect, Gaius Severus Lupus, who came from Iminium in Lusitania. And he dedicated this altar so 350 kilometers away in Brigantium in Tarraconensis. So again, another mobile architect. Now, a lot of this kind of movement at this level is almost certainly planned and directed. It's to do with commissions, particularly the state-sponsored commissions, but I'm sure that this is a focused labour movement. And in thinking about state-sponsored movement of architects and so on, I think that correspondence between Pliny and Trajan is interesting in that context. So when Pliny is in Bithynia, he writes to Trajan about the construction of an aqueduct in Nicomedia that's been beset by various problems. And he asked Trajan to send an engineer skilled in aqueduct building or an architect to sort things out. And again, when he reports to Trajan about the theatre at Nicaea, which is similarly unfinished, and in this case sinking, also a gymnasium which is badly constructed, and then some baths at Claudiopolis. Again, he asks for an architect, and we see that again in another letter of Pliny, suggesting that he's struggling to find the workers that he needs locally, or that given how all the problems with construction in that province at that time, there's a lack of skilled workers, or those that he has are not to be trusted. The fact that he's writing to Trajan to ask for these suggests that there's an expectation that would happen, that's a reasonable expectation for him to ask that. Trajan says, no, you can't have them. You can't lack architects. Every province has skilled men trained for this work. It's a mistake to think they can be sent out more quickly from Rome, when actually they usually come to us from Greece. So that sense of kind of east to west movement again. So Trajan thinks he must have local architects to use, but I think the fact that he's asking suggests that there is some state-sponsored movement going on. So architects, I guess, are towards the top of the building hierarchy, but there is evidence that other skilled workers were moving around to wherever their skills were in demand. So people like sculptors and carvers and stoneworkers, and so on. So Pliny the Elder and Plutarch, they both record a story that already in the 6th century BCE, Tarquinius Superbus commissioned Vulca, a sculptor from Veii, to come to Rome to sculpt terracotta statues. And Pliny also attributes the Gallic invasion of Italy to a Helvetian sculptor named Helico, who he says took dried figs and grapes from Rome back to Gaul when he'd finished working. Now, while those stories don't necessarily need to be true, they do indicate an idea among 1st and 2nd century CE Romans that such workers were often migrants. And actually, work on signatures on manufactured objects and buildings, for example, so the work of Seth Barnard, for example, suggests skilled labour mobility from at least the mid-Republican period onwards. And again, I mean, this isn't almost plucked at random from Pliny, but there's lots of accounts in there of sculptors and so on coming to, these examples are to Rome in particular. So we've got people from Rhodes, Tralles, Athens, Pasiteles from Magna Graeca, who actually ends with a great story about him making a relief of a lion, looking at wild beasts from Africa. And when he did so, a leopard broke out of another cage. So we have all of these literary examples, and also if we look at inscriptions, we can see this kind of mobility as well. So Nicomedia becomes a centre of, or seems to be a centre of, marble workers. And there is an association of Nicomedian sculptors at Nicopolis in northern Thrace, so in what is now Bulgaria. So there's a dedication of an altar to Hercules by two workmen on behalf of that local association of Nicomedian stone carvers. So setting up an association there suggests some sense of permanency, whether it's a kind of permanent base of Nicomedians with a changing periphery, or whether this is a one-way migratory flow. Obviously, it's difficult to know, but there's some kind of permanency and some kind of association being set up there. Actually, marble workers from Nicomedia, we do have inscriptions recording them in Leptis Magna, in Târgu in Romania, an architect in Olbia in Ukraine. So again, just like with doctors being associated with the Greek world, and you might want to have a Greek name, if you're from Nicomedia, this might kind of demonstrate your credentials again, that this shows that you are from a real centre of marble trade and marble sculpting. So it's a marker of skill, perhaps, of quality. So it's something that you want to emphasise. So that's something that might also be happening here. That said, we also have people from much less distinguished places who are telling us where they're from. So just down the road from me here, we've got Priscus, who found himself in Roman Bath. He's a stonemason, and he's from Northern Gaul. So he's telling us again, he's a lapidarius from Northern Gaul. He's dedicating an altar there to the goddess Sulis. Actually, in Ben Russell's work on stonework, there's a really interesting example that he includes there of sculptor's tools that were found in a shipwreck off Corsica, and they were found alongside a cargo of blocks of lunar marble. So a number of those tools were inscribed with initials. So they're not new, they're not cargo, they look to be personal property. So what he suggests there is we're looking at an itinerant stoneworker or a team of workers, perhaps responding to a specific commission. And the fact they're alongside blocks of marble, I think, would suggest that. I mean, it's not something you're likely to carry speculatively. And even going into late antiquity, in the 5th century, Germanus of Auxerre, there's a story in his so-called life where he's crossing over from Gaul to Italy in early summer, and he meets a party of workmen, of artifices, who are also described as mercenari. So they're clearly hired workers, probably builders, and they look to be on their way back to Italy after a period of working for hire in Gaul. So a kind of group of builders moving around there. So this is something that I think certainly needs further thought, further development. But I think, again, we probably have layers of movement. And at the most skilled levels, we are looking at focused, targeted movement, commissions in many cases. But at the level below, I think that the movement is also pretty focused. It's not random, it's planned and organised. And possibly with labour contractors. So we do know of labour contractors in other sectors. So we know of them in seasonal agricultural labour, for example. So there's this famous inscription here of the labourer who rose to be a contractor in North Africa with his own team of harvesters. Or Vespasian's great-grandfather, who apparently was a contractor for seasonal labourers who came from Umbria to the Sabine district. Now that kind of labour is more predictable than it necessarily is in construction, that annually you will need these workers. But I suspect that we also have organised movement of skilled workers within other sectors, including construction. That there's networks and associations even perhaps behind some of this movement that's happening. I think just the final point I'd like to make is to draw on some of the work that I've been doing with mines in Iberia, where we can see what look to be quite focused migratory flows of, I think, skilled workers. So, for example, at Tres Minas in Portugal, we have a cluster of workers from Clunia, which is over 300 kilometres away from Tres Minas, and they are all adult males between the ages of 20 and 40. So these are all funerary monuments. So they all died between the ages of 20 and 40. Probably skilled workers. Now we can't date them, so we don't know if they're necessarily all contemporary, but I think it's indicative of some kind of labour contractor perhaps, or chain migration, moving workers from one place to another, probably on short-term contracts, the sort of thing that we can document in the Dacian gold mines, for example, where contracts are kind of 6 months, a year. In other instances in Roman Iberia, we have what look to be migrant associations. So, for example, in the town of Capra, we have there 8 migrants from Clunia. So again, a cluster of migrants from Clunia. And we also have this Vicinia Cluniensium, so this kind of neighbourhood association of Clunians who are perhaps facilitating some kind of movement. And also in Pax Iulia, we have a Sodalicium Braccarorum, so an association of Braccarans. And not in Pax Iulia itself, but in the mines nearby at Vipasca, we have at least one Braccaran who's commemorated there, who died aged 30. So again, a young adult male, quite probably a skilled worker who's come from Bracca Augusta, hundreds of kilometres south to the mines at Vipasca. So again, some kind of chain migration or focused, planned migratory flows. So I wonder if what we can see in that sector is something that we could also transplant over to something like construction, whether we could see a similar model within that sector also. And maybe below that, and largely undocumented, is the kind of itinerant jobbing builder that we see in the medieval and the early modern period, or the kind of dollier repair worker, the cross craft worker who's moving around with a few tools, doing repairs, small jobs on the move. I think a problem of our evidence base is that that's by far the hardest sort of movement to document because it goes largely under the radar. I think that's something that we potentially could also see. So very conscious of time. So I'll leave it there. The next area that I hope to kind of move on with, because I say this is a work in progress, is to look more specifically at craft workers and see if I can find any evidence for mobility within that sector also. So I'll leave it there for now, and love to hear some thoughts and questions. Thank you.